speak about a controversial subject today, a subject I have addressed before, and one that you wonder, should it be controversial at all? And that is the subject of the truth. The truth has been controversial as an idea since time immemorial. As we'll see in the course of today's show, even back in the days of my old friend Marcus Aurelius in the 2nd century AD, there's a lot of discussion about what is truth and what is the value of truth. In fact, truth and fake truth or fake news and its effects on the world are nothing new, but they seem all the more relevant nowadays. We think that fake news is something new, or that it's only proliferated in the age of the internet. And definitely, one of the things that even motivates me to speak about it is the enormous amount of fake news and alternative truths and all of those kind of things that we see on the internet. This idea of alternative truth, which came up during the Trump presidency, really makes sense to every conversation and controversy that ever happened about truth. But fake news has always had devastating consequences. Mark Antony, the Roman general and emperor, a little bit before Marcus Aurelius, in 31 BC, after he was defeated at the Battle of Actium, heard that his lover, Cleopatra, had killed herself. So in consequence, he stabbed himself in the stomach. It was fake news, and it was fake news started by Cleopatra herself, who put out the message that she was dead in order to obviously throw her enemies off. There was no shortage of those. And of course, Mark Antony would then die in her arms in a massively original Romeo and Juliet story that of course Shakespeare would later write about. But fake news clearly had devastating consequences for Mark Antony, and in the end even had some impact on history. Today, fake news seems to be the disease itself, spreading like wildfire, creating a lot of social unrest and personal anxiety and fear, undermining institutions, society, the health system, all sorts of things, and diverting a lot of where our energy and money should go into fighting fake news rather than into dealing with the many troubles that ail us, let alone the pandemic, which needs massive human and financial resources to fight, which are all diverted into dealing with fighting about opinions and fighting about what's true. So tonight I want to talk a little bit about what the idea of truth really is, and more about what we can learn from the Stoics like Marcus Aurelius about truth. Truth isn't really so much an idea, but more like a belief or something that we assert. We're not going to go too much into the philosophical debate of is there even such a thing as an objective truth, because it even seems kind of obvious to us, let alone from experience, that there clearly isn't. There are many truths. So when we talk about some kind of objective truth, we must be limiting it in some way. But to believe something or to assert something isn't enough to actually make it true. Because really, if you think about it, saying if you believe something it's true, therefore, is a little bit like saying, well, someone else could say, if you believe something it's automatically not true, because belief and truth are not the same thing. So it's generally accepted by philosophers that for thought or something we say to be true, there must be an independent reality outside of the speaker that agrees with that thought. Doesn't automatically mean that makes it true either. But the first step is understanding that truth is beyond what we individually think. That's not really how people actually experience the truth, though. Even the philosophers like Aristotle did relate what you believe to be true to what is true. Aristotle said, to say what is and what is not is true. And so he's saying, my personal truth is true. And there's a lot of philosophers who would agree. And there's countless of people on Facebook and other social media who clearly think like that. It seems normal to a person to say, true for me. Or if I feel that to be true, it must be true. And a lot of people's decisions, whether it's about the vaccine, the biggest controversy currently raging about what's true and what isn't, or about anything else, it seems to have lost the connection to what's going on in the outer world, and this idea of true for me or feeling true seems to hold as much weight to a person as some kind of objective outside demonstration that something is true. This is the battle that is fought when people say, don't you believe science? Because it might be true, or it might be demonstrable, that science can demonstrate something to be so. But if we've reached a point where people say, well, it's just not so for me, it illustrates how the inner belief and the inner truth is stronger than anything that's going on outside. And this is one of the great problems we face today in trying to distribute good quality information. This is called the correspondence theory of truth, when people believe that something's true because it corresponds with what they believe in. And the problem is that the mind is not actually a good judge of reality. It only really can judge what fits into its ideas of reality that are already there. We've got filters and belief systems that distort and interpret and even construct our truths. In modern times, we buy into social systems like Facebook that construct truths for us. And even when people are saying it's what's true for me or what I believe to be true, in fact, they aren't the originator of that so-called truth. And they're using constructs that they're receiving from social media to create the truth or to accept the truth, driven by their own desires and what they want out of it, or their own fears and what they don't want out of it. So there's also generally an ulterior motive in people's idea of what is true and what is not true. It's become an even bigger issue in our world, where there are certainly plenty cases where we must accept people's individual personalized truths as true. A great example of that is identity, is a demonstration that you can't then argue that external truths are more true than internal truths, and demonstrates the fact that there are certainly situations where an internal truth applies. It does occur to me, though, using that example, that the problem then becomes, for all truths perhaps, but certainly for personal truths, is if it is true that truth has a personal element to it, and therefore it is not something objective and outside of us, then where do we get off trying to shove our truths down other people's throats? And that's an altogether different issue as well. People will argue that being told to believe something, told to accept something by government or by scientists or by whoever the case may be, is being told to accept an internal truth, is being told to accept, someone else's internal truth, and there isn't such a thing as an external truth. The coherence theory of truth says that something is more likely to be true if it fits into a larger coherent system of ideas and beliefs. It is still arguable that that larger system is not necessarily true itself. People have believed all sorts of things and constructed empires and religions on them. But the more we investigate, check, curate, and add to all the components that make up the supposed truth, the more likely it is that there is some kind of assumption that we can make that there is a greater truth in that situation than what I think or I believe. An example of that might be how initially archaeology was used in the late 19th century to attempt to prove the Bible. And a lot of it started disproving the Bible, or just demonstrating that the Bible seems to have a lot of fiction in it. And there was a kind of a cognitive dissonance that forced those biblical archaeologists to deconstruct a lot of that external reality and shift the belief system more into faith or symbolic truths, archetypal truths, and so on. So there was an example where enough external evidence actually started breaking down a supposed truth and forced its proponents to find an alternative explanation, literally an alternative idea of what is truth. Forces those people to say, well, the symbolic or mythical reality has greater value than all the external evidence that we can add up. Again, demonstrating to us that there is no such thing as an absolute objective truth. It's also true that a lot of how we process the information actually affects our idea about what's true. The most basic being that if we feel something to be true, if it seems to make sense to us, we consider it true, which is a very poor standard to judge the reality of something by, but is probably the most common standard, and I would vouch is probably the reason why so many people on social media believe strange things that we might find strange or very different, or they believe some kind of conspiracy or whatever we might see something as. Why do people believe such peculiar things? Is because it seems to make sense to them. And certainly what makes sense to one person is not at all what makes sense to another person. But the idea of makes sense to me, therefore it's true, is one of the great truth fallacies that you will see all over social media, especially when people argue one way or the other about what they should be doing about the epidemic, when at no point did they consult an expert. And we do live in a time when the trust in experts has been dramatically diminished, largely for political reasons, and that's probably been true throughout history as well. Remember, Cleopatra's lie was for political reasons, but it had consequences in the real world. One thing that we can all see as a result of the spread of ideas through social media, the spread of individual opinions as truth, is that repetition has a very powerful effect. Repetition gives the effect of authority. So people can say, I saw it somewhere, or lots of people say that, without really thinking it through that, social media is all about sharing. So lots of people don't really say that. All they're really doing is repeating everything else that everyone else said. But the repetition creates the value of truth, so much so that research shows that even when attempting to break down misinformation to assert truth, the repeating of the misinformation in order to give the truth instead reinforces the misinformation itself. So communication should really focus on communicating the truth and ignoring the falsity, rather than repeating it in order to try and disprove it, because that itself, amazingly, acts as a confirmation for people. Marcus Aurelius, the great Stoic teacher and emperor of Rome, in fact lived during one of the deadliest epidemics in Roman history. He ruled for most of his rule was during an epidemic which lasted 14 years, claimed the lives, of course, of hundreds of thousands of people, including Marcus himself in the end. But historians show us that the epidemic had radical effects on the Roman Empire, and in as much as there's so many things in Marcus's time and in Marcus's reign that are really a turning point in Roman history, and in terms of their culture and their art and their military practices and so on, historians actually think that a lot of the change came by because of the epidemic at the time. And basically that the epidemic had such a devastating effect on what people did and people thought and people believed that it permanently changed the course of Roman history. Basically described as a devastating blow from which the ancient world never recovered. Well, there's truth in history, and it's a pity we don't learn as much from history as we'd like to, but that could be a great lesson too. But Marcus himself, as he was dying of the plague, of the epidemic, said, "Weep not for me, think rather of the pestilence itself and the deaths of so many others." He was able to think of the greater importance and the greater danger that was happening to his world, because he was also living at a time where, of course, there must have been an enormous amount of misinformation and belief around that plague. And even though they didn't have the science of today to help them understand what an epidemic was, at the same time, they had all sorts of beliefs that were clearly getting in their way of being able to do anything about the epidemic, all sorts of beliefs and practices along the way. But Marcus was very concerned about truth, and he himself said, "Real good luck would be to abandon life without ever encountering dishonesty, or hypocrisy, or self-indulgence or pride. But the next best voyage is to die when you've had enough. Or are you determined to lie down with evil? Hasn't experience even taught you that, to avoid it like the plague? Because it is a plague, a mental cancer, worse than anything caused by tainted air or an unhealthy climate. Diseases like that can only threaten your life. This one attacks your humanity." And it's important because he says dishonesty is anti-people. It's harmful to people, and of course it is. Not only saying Cleopatra's lie to her lover Mark Antony, the obvious harm that lie caused, but the dishonesty and the perpetuation of falseness, fake news, all of those things which we see all around us today is an anti-humanity act. I mean, I have to admit, I regularly wonder, why is it so important for people to go on and on social media about their fringe views? So the people who are against the vaccine, you don't really have any evidence to support their what are often very wild claims about the vaccine. None of which is evidence-based, but it's already based on someone else said it, or what I feel to be true, or otherwise a conspiracy that requires vast organization, the likes of which have really never been seen in human history at all. None of those objective things make any difference. What seems to be so important is people asserting their own agenda. Whereas Marcus says you should be thinking of other people at a time like this. It's a greater harm to spread falseness than it is to spread the plague. But Marcus says everything we hear is an opinion, not a fact. Everything we see is a perspective, not the truth. Those were his words. So Marcus was really more forgiving despite that, because he said, the fact is there are liars in the world, and you have to accept that. There are people who perpetuate their own agendas for whatever reason. As I say, I don't understand why people feel the need to constantly repeat either their anti-vax views or their anti-COVID views, whatever, consistently all the time. It seems to me an exercise in ego, a need to be right, a need to be the one who told you so, need to be the savior in some way. Marcus said, there have to be shameless people in the world. The person in front of you might just be one of them. Remembering that a whole class must necessarily exist will enable you to tolerate its members. That's also a powerful statement. He says, just remember the world is composed of truth-tellers, of liars, of believers, of every kind of person. And in order for us all to exist, there must be such kind of people. So we must relax and let them be and be patient. He says the only thing that isn't worthless is to live this life out truthfully and rightly and be patient with those that don't. So that means whatever we think about each other's opinions, whoever's right and whoever's wrong, in the end we need to be true to ourselves as best as possible, true to others as best as possible, and be patient with those who are not so. His teacher was the slave Epictetus, the freed slave Epictetus, who himself said, men are not disturbed by things, but by their opinions about them. It's not the physical, factual world that really rubs us up the wrong way. It's our beliefs and our imposing our opinions on each other that really riles us up. So Epictetus goes on to say, and here's a really great lesson for all of us in dealing with the onslaught in social media and dealing with the fact that many of our friends seem to have turned into weird disbelievers in science, believers in strange things, or perpetuators of strange beliefs. Epictetus said, any person capable of angering you becomes your master. He can anger you only when you permit yourself to be disturbed by him. He goes on to say, do you neglect to master your thoughts and actions while foolishly seeking to discern truth from reality? While foolishly seeking to discern truth from falsity. You've abandoned your pursuit of the first, mastering yourself, in order to choose what comes after, seeking the difference between truth and reality. Look to your desires and your motives. Only then will you be a receptacle of the truth. And that is, I think, the ultimate lesson that we must learn in dealing with the world full of competing truths, loud untruths, or so it seems. In a world where truth has become so relative that even the science, which culturally we fought so hard to become the arbiter of truth, has become just another voice in all of that. Epictetus is saying, in the end, worrying more about that than mastering your own thinking and acting makes you unfit to even hold the truth itself. If you master your own thoughts and actions, if you're true to yourself, then you're a receptacle for truth. And so he says, essentially, those who spread ideas, those who stand on their bandwagons and post over and over again on Facebook every little bit of so-called evidence or link they can find. Epictetus is saying, why are you doing that? Are you so determined to push your truth because you can't look at yourself? What is it about you that makes you want to do that? What is it about you that makes you want to put your truth out there over and over again and have other people believe it? We can ask that question about so many things and about little things, not only about people who are ranting on about something, about so many of our conversations. In the end, truth is clearly something subjective. Truth is clearly not something out there in the world that we can go and find. And once we understand that the truth is not objective, it becomes just as dubious to assert your theory than you claim it is to assert science or the official view or whatever the case may be. So those of us who seek to portray truth, remember it is only ever your truth. And if it's your truth, there probably isn't a need or a reason to share that with anyone else because they've probably got their truth. In the end, the lesson from Epictetus is that if there is no outside truth, it makes no sense to say that they're all wrong, the scientists or the conspirators. and I'm right, or we are right. If you are able to say what you are told is the truth is not true, then you have to be able to say mine is just another opinion. It's no more objectively true than anything else out there. If people did that with their outrageous and controversial beliefs on Facebook, there'd be a lot more humility and a lot more of the truth that really counts, the truth about ourselves. I'll be back here at the usual time next week. See you then.